the session that we're going to look at this afternoon is the lie that is holding volunteer managers back. So this is hopefully captured your attention, piqued your interest. We're going to be here for at most an hour. It's just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon for me here in the UK. So we'll be finishing around 4 p.m. my time, which is around 11 a.m. Eastern in the US. I'm going to speak for about half an hour or so, 40 minutes, depending on whether or not I feel like I've got more to say. And then we'll throw it open for Q&A and discussion when we get to that point as well. There's a little bit of interactivity in here too, but because we're on the Zoom webinar rather than the Zoom meeting, that interactivity is going to be limited to the chat. So when we get to those points, it'd be lovely to see your input in the chat. So despite that generous introduction from Diana, not everybody will have come across me or not everybody will know who I am. So let me just introduce myself. Hello, I'm Rob. I am based in a town called Grantham in Lincolnshire, which for those of you who aren't familiar with the UK, we're about 110 miles north of London. We're on the main railway line that goes between London and Edinburgh up in Scotland. So we're over to the eastern side of the country. My background is well over 30 years now working in the volunteering movement. I started in student volunteering in the mid-1990s, spent a couple of years with one of our big children's services organisations, then left there and spent 6 years working with one of our big sight loss organisations, where I was involved in volunteering in fundraising and marketing, very different from the kind of children's services stuff that I'd done before. What my late mother used to call my last proper job. I was a director at Volunteering England. So I was part of the senior leadership team responsible for a lot of our external and government funded projects as well. I left there in 2011 and since then have been working as a freelancer. So I do a bunch of different things. I do speaking at events. I do training, either at webinars or less often than it used to be, unfortunately, in-person sessions. I do a lot of consulting. So I've spent most of today so far doing listening exercises with volunteers and staff at a large organisation that I'm currently consulting with. And then the last bit is kind of thought leadership, writing, podcasting, all of those kinds of things. I have a blog that I publish every couple of weeks. Next issue is out on Friday of this week, where I'm looking at what the things that I've seen and heard in the sector this year that I thought were really good. So great podcasts, great articles, things like that. And I have a podcast myself called Advancing the Profession, which we just finished the 4th season of last week. So you can go and find Advancing the Profession on all good podcast platforms and have a listen into the 4 seasons that we've done so far. The final slide in the slide deck today has got my contact details, including a Linktree link that you can go to, and you can find all of that information for all of those various different resources online. Most of it's completely free, so you can access it if you wish. I like our audience today, who are international in nature. I have also worked internationally as well, so I've done a lot of work in Australia, New Zealand, the US and Canada as well. As Diana was saying, I've hosted, and it's been a great privilege of mine to host the last 3 volunteer management hybrid conferences. And it's been great to engage with people through those various different activities. So that's me. That's a little bit about me and kind of my credentials. And really, this session today is not something that I've done a lot over the course of the last few years. I think the first time I presented this was at the Points of Light conference when it was in St. Paul, Minnesota a few years ago. I think that was about 2018, something like that. And then it's mainly been through webinars over the last couple of years. But I think it's an interesting session to kind of reflect on and think about how writing and thinking and resources outside of our sector, outside of volunteering, outside of the voluntary sector, can have a bearing on the work that we do as volunteer engagement professionals. So the opening bit of this is a question that I would like to ask you. And the reason why there's a unicorn on here is because lies and myths are kind of related to each other. Myths are supposedly kind of fictional things that happen that we employ stuff to. But equally, the unicorn was, for those of you that knew her, Susan J. Ellis's favourite animal, and therefore the unicorn is there in tribute to Susan. If you're not familiar with Susan, go check out her writing. She was one of the first volunteer management consultants in the 70s and she was a titan in our field until she passed away 8 years ago now. So the question is this: what is a favorite myth or lie that you have heard about volunteers through your work? So I'll give you an example to get you started, that we can't trust volunteers with access to confidential information. They're free. Yes, Carrie, thank you for getting that straight in there. Volunteers are unreliable. They're easy to get. They're too much work. They take jobs from people. They will take my job. They come when we need them at a moment's notice. Yes, the defrostable volunteer, the microwavable volunteer that we can just readily pull out. They're all retired and no good on computers. Yeah, I think that myth's been pretty much blown out of the water over the last few years. Another one similar from Karen. Hi, Karen. Seniors won't use technology. You've got a lot in the cupboard. Michelle from the Auckland Project is joining us. Michelle, Auckland Project is a heritage volunteering or heritage organisation in the Northeast. Michelle has just won the Heritage Volunteer Leader of the Year award here in the UK. So congratulations, Michelle. I'm going to embarrass you on this platform. They're just volunteers. They're unskilled. They'll be happy to do all the training asked of them. They only volunteer because they want a job. Yeah, loads and loads of those kinds of myths. And we hear these all the time, don't we? We hear them from other people. Yeah, thank you, Angela, for congratulating Michelle. That's great. Nice to see it. Yeah, we hear these myths all the time, and we have to kind of counter them. I suppose my favourite one is that volunteers are kind of, a number of you have picked it up on it as well. You know, volunteers are unreliable or untrustworthy because of what they get paid, i.e., nothing. And one of my favourite lines, some of you will have heard me say this before, is there are some really well-paid people in the world who are incredibly poor at what they do, and there are some incredibly unpaid people in the world who are really, really good at what they do. Pay does not equal competence. So yeah, we need to challenge these myths. But there is also a myth and a lie that we might sometimes tell ourselves when we're struggling in the day-to-day work. And a couple of you picked up on this as well in your responses to that last question. I'm going to close the chat because it's distracting me. And the lie that we may tell, or our organizations may tell, is probably more accurate, is people today just don't want to volunteer. And that isn't true at all. The idea that people just don't want to volunteer is not true. And there is a growing body of research that demonstrates that. And the lie, that myth that people today don't want to volunteer, has really grown from what many of us have seen around the world in declining rates of volunteering after the COVID-19 pandemic. In some parts of the world, those rates have continued to recover. But in places like England and Canada, for example, we know that those volunteering rates, both formal and informal volunteering, are in decline. So people naturally go, well, that means people today just don't want to volunteer. But the research is increasingly, as I say, not bearing that out. So we have a survey that's been done regularly for about the last 24, 25 years here in England called the Community Life Survey. The last lot of data was published just over a year ago now, around about a year ago. And what they found was that 32% of people, when they were asked why they volunteered, said they volunteered because they had time. And a lot of the time we hear or we buy into this idea that one of the reasons people don't volunteer is because they don't have time. Yet a third of people are saying, do you know what, I've got time. And actually what we've seen is that's gone up since the COVID pandemic. So more people now than were saying this kind of 5 years ago are saying, do you know what, I volunteer because I've got time to volunteer. When they ask about why they don't volunteer, the flip to that, it isn't that they don't have time. It's 33% of people said that the barrier to volunteering was that they had other things to do with their spare time. So it's not I don't have time to volunteer, it's that I am prioritizing other things in my life. There are other things that I want to spend my spare time doing than volunteering. I might want to spend time with my partner. I want to spend time with my kids. I might want to spend time walking the dog. I might want to spend time going to the theatre or to the cinema or going to a concert or traveling or anything else that I could spend my spare time doing. That's the barrier for me to volunteer. And that's what people are experiencing. And in fact, that when I say 33% said that the barrier to volunteering was that they had other things to do with their spare time, it's the second biggest barrier that people state in this research after work commitments. So people feel that they can't volunteer because work would get in the way of their paid work. But actually, the next biggest barrier is I've got other things to do. And I think that's probably been exacerbated by COVID. I don't know anybody that when they came out of lockdown, I'm sure there were people, but I don't know anybody that when we came out of lockdown, certainly here in the UK, went, yes, I can go back and volunteer. They were like, I can go and see my friends that I've not been able to see, or my grandparents, or my parents, or my kids, or, all of those other things were a bigger priority for people. COVID forced a lot of us to reevaluate how we spend our spare time. And volunteering has perhaps slipped down that agenda. Doesn't mean people don't want to do it. Doesn't mean people haven't got the time to do it. They're just prioritizing other things. And so why is that kind of contradiction there? Well, interestingly, there was another piece of research that was done that looked at how people spent their spare time in the UK between 2000 and 2015. So this is pre-COVID. And the biggest area that they spent, the biggest increase in the amount of their leisure time that they spent doing stuff was engaging in streaming services, or before that, if you remember the days before streaming services, box sets of DVDs and video cassettes and all of those kinds of things. Consumption of mass media. So realistically, when we are trying to get people to come forward and volunteer with our organization, when we are trying to raise above the kind of noise that's out there competing for people's attention, we're competing with things like these streaming services. We're competing with anything that can draw people's spare time away. That means we're competing with marketing budgets, which are millions, if not billions of dollars higher than our nonprofits can ever imagine. But we have a unique product compared to those. We have volunteering as something that is really unique and special. We know that volunteering can improve people's physical health. It can improve people's mental health. You live longer if you volunteer. We've got all of this stuff. Watching Stranger Things 5 on Netflix does not make you live longer. In fact, if your experience of watching the first 4 episodes is anything like mine, it just makes you more stressed than you were before you sat down to watch it. So our job as leaders of volunteer engagement is to try and market volunteering to people in such a way that they want to spend some of their spare time volunteering with us. We have to prioritize, which brings us back to the kind of the lie that we tell ourselves, or when I first delivered this session, the name of the session, the title of the session was All Volunteer Managers Are Liars. Now, I don't believe all volunteer managers are liars for a second. I stole that title from Seth Godin, because Seth Godin has the book. And if you haven't read this book, I really encourage you to go and do it. It's called All Marketers Are Liars. But then he crosses the are liars off bit and says, tells stories. And I think that's the point, really. When we try and market stuff, we want to grab people's attention. So in terms of marketing this, the lie that we tell ourselves around volunteering, or all volunteer managers are liars, it grabs your attention. Seth said people just wouldn't read the book if it just was another book about marketing. We've got to grab people's attention. So let me share 3 quotes with you from Seth's book that I just kind of want to, I think, illustrate the point about how we need to get better at marketing. So right early on in the book, Seth says this: I wasn't being completely truthful with you when I named this book. Marketers aren't liars, any more than volunteer managers are all liars. They're good storytellers. I was trying to go to the edges. Nobody would hate a book called All Marketers Are Storytellers. Nobody would disagree with it. Nobody would challenge me on it. Nobody would talk about it. Whereas if we're doing our marketing well, people will talk about it. Sessions on volunteer recruitment are a dime a dozen. You can go to sessions on volunteer recruitment all over the place. But the kind of point of using the title that we've used in today was it hooked you in. It got you intrigued. You wanted to know more. And that's what we need to be doing when we reach out to people to volunteer. We don't need to have yet another recruitment message that says, we need volunteers, help, we urgently need volunteers, we desperately need volunteers. We want people to feel compelled to find out more, to get involved, as you hopefully were to come to this session. So handing on to Seth again. Sorry, that's gone too far. Marketing is about taking something people may or may not want and telling a story to turn that something into a thing that people definitely want. What we're talking about here in recruitment and in marketing is about taking volunteering, something people have thought about, they may never have thought about, and creating a story around it so that people definitely want to get involved in it. They definitely want to get engaged with it. And I'll give you some examples of how organizations have been creative in that in a few minutes' time. Oh, again, there we go. And again, this is a great illustration of the power of these stories. As Seth says, all marketers tell stories. And if they do it right, we believe them. We believe that a glass of wine tastes better if the glass costs $20 than $1. We believe that an $80,000 Porsche Cayenne is vastly superior to a $36,000 Volkswagen, even if it's virtually the same car. It's built in the same factory on the same chassis. We believe that $225 Puma sneakers will make our feet feel better and look cooler than $20 no-names from the store on Main Street. And believing it makes it true. So we need to do this job of selling volunteering and marketing volunteering in a way that people think it's going to be exciting and cool. Here in the UK in 2012, we hosted the London Olympic and Paralympic Games. And what the organising committee did was they didn't call the volunteers. Some 70,000 people volunteered during the Olympic and Paralympic Games, selected from about 250,000 applicants. They didn't call them volunteers. They called them games makers. They gave them groovy uniforms that made them look cool. And they got a lot of publicity from it. And the research shows that immediately after the Olympic and Paralympic Games, more people were reporting that they did volunteering. Did that mean more people were inspired to volunteer by the Olympics? Possibly. But I think it was more likely that people were more likely to identify as volunteers because the games makers made volunteering look cool and sexy and interesting. Whereas prior to the Olympics, they didn't think their volunteering was that special. So what might this mean for us? If we want to market volunteering with our organizations in a compelling way that inspires people to spend some of their precious spare time with us, not doing other things, then there's two areas that I think we need to focus on. We need to focus on the opportunities that we provide, so matching what we offer with what people want. And we need to look at the volunteer experience that people will have. And if you go onto my blog, again, there'll be a link at the end of the session, and you'll get it in the handout from today as well, because you'll get all of these slides. When I did an original blog post about this, I talked about influencers, so social media influencers and changing other people's worldviews. I'm not going to cover that here. So if you want that kind of perspective on it, then you definitely want to go and have a look at the blog post. So let's have a think, first of all, about the opportunities that we provide. Then I'll briefly talk about the volunteer experience we let people have. And then I'll kind of draw it together with a couple of quotes, and we'll throw it open for some questions. So some of this is based actually on a really great piece of research I think a lot of people have forgotten about. It came out around 2011 from Volunteer Canada. They got to the Canadian representatives on the call today, called Bridging the Gap. And it was looking at what they identified in Canada as a kind of growing disconnect between what organizations were offering and what people wanted to do. And I think it was really quite far ahead of its time, actually, because we're grappling with many of those same issues today. But that research was starting to really articulate this, 9 years before any of us had heard the words COVID-19 and global pandemic and thought that they would apply to us. So some of the things that they were talking about were this: how can we look for group opportunities? So we know that people want to volunteer in groups. That came through very strongly in the Bridging the Gap research. In many of the studies around the world that I read about why people choose to volunteer or what would attract them into volunteering, we know that one of the big reasons is meeting people and making friends, having that kind of connection. And that's probably more important now, given the way that so much of our lives have pivoted, partly through the growth of technology, partly through the changes that the pandemic brought on around the world, to living our lives online. So interestingly, I'm going to reference time well spent research more fully later on, but a piece of research was published here in 2019 in the UK, called Time Well Spent. One of the questions that they asked volunteers, they said, how important to you is volunteering as a way of combating social isolation, of making you feel less isolated in your day-to-day life? And what was really surprising coming out of that research was the age groups that said it was most important to them were 18 to 24-year-olds and 25 to 34-year-olds. So Gen Z for our American colleagues, and the kind of younger end of the millennial generation as well, we're saying volunteering is really important to us because we feel quite isolated and we want to connect with people through that. And we've seen that as some of the research has been done around Gen Z and volunteering as well. That whole kind of generation that's grown up online, they've grown up comfortable with technology, they've grown up with access to social media, and it's provided ways for us to connect like never before around the globe, but it's also left many of us feeling more isolated. So how can we provide those opportunities that allow people to connect online, but also allow people to connect face to face? People are desperate. Many people are desperate to get back to some sort of face-to-face connection as well. So how can we use a blend of the two? Again, that sense of meeting people, making friends, really important for people, a common motivator. Two great examples. We had an organisation in London, in the UK, a few years ago, that offered people the opportunity to come together in groups with complete strangers and volunteer to do things like park cleanups, river cleanups, canal cleanups. I'd say beach cleanups, but any of you who've been to London know there's not many beaches in London. But the way that they pitched what they did was not, we're a volunteering project. The organisation was called Good Deed Dating. So the idea was they were recruiting singles who would get together with a group of other singles who were similarly minded, wanting to do a project like this. They would spend some time volunteering together, and then maybe as a group, they go down the pub or something like that, and they go to a bar, they have a conversation afterwards, and maybe you meet the love of your life through doing that. Not unique to the UK. There's been organisations like that across the pond in North America for years, but a very different way of marketing, of selling that story around volunteering. So what are the group opportunities that we're offering? Do we have those group opportunities? If we don't, can we create those group opportunities? When I started in volunteer engagement in the mid-90s, one of the popular group opportunities where everybody could just sit round a table, chat to each other and volunteer at the same time was putting newsletters in envelopes, ready for mailings to go out, envelope stuffing. We've got rid of that because we've got things like Constant Contact and we've got things like MailChimp now. So how can we think differently about the way that we structure our roles so that we can bring people together? The next one is offering people the opportunities that use their skills and talents. So here is somebody in the image skilled in the practice of underwater basket weaving. So not just a headline on resume, on their CV, but what is it that they have a skill, a talent, an aptitude, an enthusiasm, a passion for? How do we market volunteering instead of saying we need you to do these roles, to say what would you like to do? What can you bring to us? And how can we make best use of that to fulfill our mission and our goals as an organisation? Now, quite often people will come in and they'll bring those skills and talents and they'll fit quite nicely into the roles that we have. But there are occasions where by taking a different approach, we're opening ourselves up to all this kind of new potential. We never thought that somebody would offer us that kind of skill or talent or passion or interest. We can create something new for them. It's much more of a kind of collaborative approach. It's much more of a personalized approach. It's much more of an approach that resonates with the way that people engage with brands away from volunteering. You know, you go and buy a coffee, something as simple as buying a coffee. People, when you order your coffee, they ask for your name because they want to make it a more of a personalized experience. So how can we do that? Equally, how can we recognize the skills that people have brought us, but they maybe aren't using in their volunteering at the moment and would like to use, but we've not had that conversation with them beforehand. So there's some great stats from the original Time Well Spent research that show that something like 16% of volunteers got involved in volunteering because they really love to use the skills and talents, but they're not being used in the organisation. And again, that was really important to 25 to 34-year-olds. So if you're particularly looking at recruiting younger people, being open to what those people can bring you rather than thinking we as an organization know it all. We're just going to plug people into roles to give them a bit of experience to help them get a job. I think this is a really good one as well. Opportunities that empower people, not control people. One of the last pieces of work I did at Volunteering England was providing the secretariat for something called the Volunteer Rights Inquiry. It was looking into really quite serious relationship breakdowns between volunteers and their organisations that were taking place around about that time, 2007, 8, 9, 10, something like that. And one of the volunteers that gave evidence to the inquiry said this, and it stuck with me. She said, the problem with volunteer management and volunteer involving organisations is they've become all about what volunteers can't do, not what volunteers can do. We've spent more time as we've kind of developed more systems and processes, as we become more risk adverse, saying, no, volunteers can't do that, volunteers can't do that, volunteers can't do this, rather than opening ourselves up to the potential of what they bring. So yeah, one of the things Barry was saying was, I'm a competent and well-educated individual. I've left volunteer positions when I wasn't being given enough autonomy on my assignments and my projects. I feel like I was being micromanaged, and I didn't like it when I wasn't empowered to do the job for which I was volunteering. Another one of my favourite lines, paid staff do not have a monopoly on good ideas and innovative solutions. Sometimes it's the volunteers that bring those solutions to us. Sometimes it's the volunteers that are the people that innovate. In fact, most of our non-profits started because volunteers innovated with the first one. We need to create opportunities that don't require a lifetime commitment. You've got to be careful how far you take this analogy. And it's been around for a while and it gains popularity and then it wanes again. But quite often, if our organisations are asking somebody for a regular and or long-term commitment on day one, and we're expecting them to say yes, it's like expecting a stranger that you meet on the street to accept an immediate marriage proposal when you've never met before. People aren't going to make that kind of commitment unless they're really, really, really desperate. So we need to recognise that there's a whole kind of process before we get to that. Well, there's a whole process of kind of wooing the volunteer, dating the volunteer, not literally, figuratively, dating the volunteer, giving them an opportunity to try out the organisation, see if they're compatible. If they are, maybe do a bit more volunteering, deepen the relationship until they want to make a commitment for a long term. And we need to be offering those kind of light touch, flexible opportunities where people can try us out as well as we're trying them out before anybody makes a long-term commitment. Again, the time well spent research that was published here in the UK in 2019, nearly a quarter of people who volunteer do so exclusively as part of a one-off activity or dip in and out. Look at the success of an organisation like Parkrun, for example, where people can go to Parkrun, but they don't have to go every week. They don't have to participate every week. If they get involved in volunteering at Parkrun, there are a range of things that they can do. Again, they don't have to do the same thing every week. They don't even have to volunteer every week. It's really flexible. We're not asking people to jump through loads of hoops or make a sign up to doing 6 shifts every week for the next 10 years of their life on day one. Not all of us have that flexibility and that opportunity, but if we're competing with what people can spend their spare time doing, that opens up opportunities for us to collaborate with each other. So we may not have those light touch opportunities, but another organisation in our community might. So how can we partner together so that volunteers can flow between our organisations? The next one is opportunities that are well advertised. So it's important to recognise in this advertising, marketing, we're all kind of talking about aspects of the same kind of thing. So we're talking about adverts, ways that we promote our volunteering that tell a story, that stand out, that importantly sell a product, in our case volunteering, based on what the consumer, the potential volunteer, will gain and will benefit, not how we will. Most of our volunteer recruitment advertising still to this day stands out compared to any other form of advertising because it sells the product based on what we're going to gain as the organisation, not what the individual is going to gain. Lexus do not sell cars by saying, buy a Lexus, it increases our shareholder value. They sell cars by making Lexus a lifestyle choice, a luxury brand. I could give you loads of examples of bad volunteer recruitment messages. Martin J. Cowling, colleague from Australia, and I were somewhere in the UK, is as precise as I will do it to save the embarrassment of anybody who might inadvertently be on the call. And we walked past a charity shop, thrift shop, op shop, depending on where you are in the world. And big sheets of paper had been put in the windows saying, we urgently need volunteers. And Martin was straight out taking a picture of that as a bad example of a volunteer recruitment. This is one of my favorite ones. It's again one that Martin sent me years ago. It was outside of an op shop, thrift store, charity shop in New Zealand. Charity Barns wanted urgently surplus goods and volunteers. Give us your surplus volunteers as well as your surplus goods, because we need them urgently. That is not going to inspire somebody walking past to get involved in volunteering. And in fact, Liza Dyer from over in the Pacific Northwest, over in Oregon, used to have a thing called VM Snart, which Gretchen from Alive used to continue. I'm going to use these next two images that really illustrate this point of how people respond to actually our poor advertising like that. So this is how we think people are going to respond when you say that you desperately need volunteers. And yet this is how people actually respond when they see that kind of recruitment message coming across. We need to do better than that. We need to do better in terms of recruitment messaging. So I'm going to share three examples with you. The first one's pretty controversial, or it was at the time, might not be now. Second one's nothing to do with volunteer recruitment, it's to do with the military. The third one was unique to the London Underground. So here's the first one. Try something new in the bedroom. And then it was, if you can see the text down the bottom, it says micro-volunteering is bite-sized action that anyone can do at home. This was run by an organisation that had a track record of running sometimes quite controversial volunteer recruitment messages, sometimes quite visible. They were put on the side of London buses, really to try and shake up people's perception of volunteering and to get people to think differently. And this was really about recognising that with the growth of technology, volunteering is something that you can do in your bed. You can do it in your PJs. You can do it on your smartphone, on your laptop, on your tablet. You don't have to come into an office anymore. This was definitely before COVID, but I think it did a really good job of kind of shaking people up. It was quite controversial. A lot of people, maybe some of you would agree, but a lot of people at the time really didn't like this. They thought it pushed it too far. But I thought it was really quite, whether we believe that or not, it was kind of quite creative at coming up with a different way. That's not your typical volunteer recruitment advert. The next one is one that was done probably about 6 or 7 years ago now. It was done by the British Army, and it was aimed at getting young people aged 16 to 18 to join the military. Now, to be really clear, this is an advert that is not aimed at young people who have maybe grown up all their lives wanting to be soldiers. This is getting 16 to 18-year-olds who probably never thought about it to consider the idea of becoming a soldier. And this is what they shared. Don't join the army. Don't stand on your own 2 feet. Don't make a difference. Don't make friends that last a lifetime. Don't find out what you're capable of. Don't become a better you. Working on the reverse psychology argument that in probably those of you who've got teenagers, had teenagers, if you're honest with yourself when you were a teenager, the last thing that you did was what somebody in authority told you to do. So you reverse the message round and we might get them to think about it. Wouldn't this be brilliant as a volunteer recruitment message? Don't volunteer. Don't stand on your own 2 feet. Don't make a difference. Don't make friends that last a lifetime. Don't find out what you're capable of. Don't become a better you. In fact, it was long enough ago now that you can probably steal this, and particularly if you're not in the UK, you're probably on even safer ground to steal it and give it a try. So I think that was really quite striking as a way of kind of getting people to think about this. Now, the third and final example that I want to show you, and then I'm going to talk about delivering volunteer experience, I need to kind of contextualize for you. So those of you who have ever been on the tube, on the London Underground, will know that when you're on the London Underground, everybody generally just sits there or stands there. Nobody makes eye contact with each other. It's a bit like the subway in New York. Nobody makes eye contact with each other. You definitely don't talk to each other. It's a bit of a weird environment. And what London Underground have above the seats is a series of advertising panels. And years ago, they started doing things like putting poems on the Underground, it's called. So like poems in these advertising panels, so that people had something to read because you didn't want to make eye contact with somebody. And so these adverts, quite often they'll get a high number of people looking at them. So we have an organization here in the UK called VSO. It's kind of like the US Peace Corps kind of idea, where they recruit professionals and they go overseas and they use their skills volunteering in international development. The next advert I'm going to put up is one of those adverts that was used on the tube. So it's wordy because they wanted people to look at it and they knew they had a captive audience between stations for people looking at it. But I think it's a really neat way of advertising volunteering in a really kind of contextually specific way without necessarily saying we urgently need volunteers. The advert says this: some people will remember an ad of ours forever. They were where you are now, enjoying a lovely tube ride, looking forward to the winter streets above, going to work, going home, same old, same old. But they read our ad on the tube one day. They decided it was time for a change, not just in their lives, but in the state of the world. They're not on this train anymore. They are living and working in the poorest countries in the world. They volunteered to share their professional experience, to leave behind the ordinary and the everyday and make every day extraordinary. They are doing it now. So can you. This is another one of those ads. This is the website. This is the telephone number. Is this your day? Really lovely bit of copywriting. Really, really lovely bit of copywriting, but very much relevant to the kind of specific context that people were engaging with it in. So we've talked about different kinds of opportunities. We've talked about different ways of marketing, how we can kind of put those messages across in attractive ways. The other area that I said was about delivering great volunteer roles and great volunteer experiences. And I'm firmly of the opinion that our role as volunteer engagement professionals increasingly these days is about helping people to create and curate meaningful and impactful volunteer experiences. Creating and curating meaningful and impactful volunteer experiences. Now, the time well spent research that I've mentioned a few times, it was a major study that was published in 2019. It was done amongst a representative sample of 10,000 people in England, Wales, and Scotland. They talked to volunteers, they talked to lapsed volunteers, and they talked to non-volunteers. And at the end of it, they came out with 8 things that need to be present in all volunteering opportunities and all volunteering roles and all volunteering relationships to make those opportunities positive and meaningful for volunteers. And they're actually baked into our Investing in Volunteers standard now. Here are the 8 things. Again, you can quickly screenshot this, but you will get these in the slide deck afterwards. We need to create volunteer roles and opportunities that are inclusive. They offer inclusive volunteering opportunities and experience to everybody. We need to create roles that are flexible, volunteer journeys that can adapt to the variety of volunteers and their life circumstances. We need to create volunteer roles that are impactful, that maximize the impact volunteering has on volunteers and on those that they help as well. Volunteers don't just want to make a contribution, they genuinely want to make a difference, cliche as that may be. Volunteer roles that are connected, strengthening connections that are at the heart of volunteering. And then if we work from bottom up on the other side, volunteer roles that are meaningful, supporting volunteers to give time in ways that are meaningful to them. I think that, interestingly, those 2 things, connected and meaningful, are probably things that we often underplay, but are something that we almost uniquely offer. We live in a world where people are constantly overwhelmed by the change, by the negative news stories, by what's going on. They feel that they can't make a difference. And through our volunteering, we can help create meaningful roles that connect people to something bigger than themselves to give them that sense of belonging and empowerment. And I think that's really important. We don't play that up enough, in my view. Roles that are genuinely voluntary, that ensure volunteering feels truly voluntary at all times. People can choose to do it and choose not to do it. Volunteer roles that are enjoyable, that try to make the experience enjoyable, rewarding, fun, fulfilling for the volunteer. And volunteer roles are balanced, that ensure an appropriate level of formalisation, that we're not overly bureaucratizing volunteering when people want to do it. Colleen Kelly in Canada said many, many years ago now that what we do in volunteer engagement is we recognise that volunteering is not the same as paid work, because what we do is we pay people with meaning. If we give people a great experience, they will tell others about it. And we're always down, I think, a little bit on word of mouth, but it's one of the most powerful forms of marketing and storytelling that we can do. We want to give our volunteers a great story to tell their friends and family so that we attract more volunteers in. So, concluding, all volunteer managers aren't liars. I'm not calling you all liars. I'm not calling myself a liar. But we are wrong, and our organisations are wrong if we think people today don't want to volunteer. But to get them involved, we need to create opportunities that match people's interests and availabilities and pay people with meaning. We need to provide a great volunteer experience. We need to tell stories and get our volunteers to tell stories about those great opportunities and experiences that we have on offer in a way that resonates with the people that we want to recruit. And I want to leave the last word to a quote from some research that was done in Victoria in Australia earlier on this year, the state of volunteering in Victoria. I think it's my favourite quote paragraph on volunteer engagement I've seen throughout the whole of 2025. And it says this: "The task ahead is not to restore volunteering to what it once was, but to recognise and support what it is becoming. The energy, the willingness, and the care are all still here. The question is, will our institutions, will our practices, and will our strategies evolve to meet them?" I think that's the challenge we face going into a new year as 2026 starts. And that's the challenge that we face as volunteer involving organisations and volunteer engagement professionals. Are we prepared to lead our institutions, our practices, and our strategies to develop in a way that evolves to meet the way that people want to engage? If we are, we'll find plenty of people want to volunteer. If we're not, then we will buy into the narrative that nobody wants to volunteer. So I'm going to put my contact details up on the slide so that you've got them. The Linktree link down the bottom here is the one that I recommend you go to, because that will provide you with all my contact details, where I am on social media, if you want to connect after today, and we're not connected already, where you can find the blog, the podcast, a whole bunch of other resources as well. Look, we are at the top of the hour, folks. We're out of time. Thank you very much for your participation today. Thank you very much for your enthusiasm. I've not been able to keep on track of the comments, but I hope it's really resonated with you. I hope you're leaving this session with something useful, some new ideas, and hopefully some new connections as well.